Welcome to Simple Times. Today we're rolling with the Ghostbusters. Back then they were chasing slime and saving New York, but let's fast forward and see how they look today. In the summer of 1984, moviegoers met a scientist unlike any they'd seen before. He wasn't buried in books, he wasn't rattling off equations, he was laid back, sarcastic, and usually the first to make a joke at someone else's expense. His name was Dr. Peter Venkman, and behind the proton pack was Bill Murray, a 33-year-old comedian already making waves for his sharp wit and unpredictable style. Now, Venkman wasn't your typical hero. While Egon and Ray were busy geeking out over ghost traps and paranormal theories, Venkman was hitting on research subjects and cracking wise about the apocalypse. He wasn't there to prove scientific theories. He was there for the paycheck and maybe the chance to impress Sigourney Weaver. And yet, that's exactly why audiences loved him. He was the audience's stand-in. The guy reacting how we would react if the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man started crushing buildings downtown. Bill Murray, at that time, was coming off his run on Saturday Night Live and hits like Caddyshack and Stripes. He had already built a reputation as the guy who never stuck to the script. Directors would set up a scene, and Murray would casually wander in, improvise half the dialogue, and somehow make it better. That unpredictability gave Ghostbusters its magic. You never quite knew what Peter Venkman was going to say, and honestly, neither did the cast standing next to him. But behind the wisecracks was an undeniable charm. Murray's timing, his chemistry with Dan Aykroyd and Harold Ramis, his banter with Sigourney Weaver, it all clicked. Ghostbusters became a box office phenomenon, and Venkman turned into one of the most iconic characters in comedy history. Over the years, Bill Murray's career took turns nobody expected. He became more than just the funny guy. Groundhog Day showed us his depth. Lost in Translation earned him an Oscar nomination, and his collaborations with Wes Anderson made him this cool, understated figure in indie cinema. He could still be hilarious, but there was now this bittersweet edge to him. Like the class clown who'd grown up but never lost that twinkle in his eye. Today, Bill Murray is 74 years old, and while he's still working, he's also embraced his reputation as Hollywood's most unpredictable legend. Stories about him just popping up at random, bartending at a wedding, crashing a karaoke party, or showing up to play kickball with strangers, have become part of his myth. He's as much a folk hero now as he is an actor. And then, decades later, he strapped on the proton pack again. In Ghostbusters Afterlife, 2021, seeing Murray back as Venkman was more than just fan service. It was like catching up with an old friend. Older, sure, but still sharp, still sarcastic, still Peter Venkman. Bill Murray proved something rare. The funniest guy in the room doesn't fade with time. He adapts, he surprises, and he lingers. Just like Venkman, Murray isn't really about saving the world. He's about reminding us not to take it too seriously, and making us laugh when we need it most. If Peter Venkman was the wisecracking heart of Ghostbusters, then Raymond Stantz was its soul. Played by Dan Aykroyd, Ray wasn't just another scientist. He was the believer. Wide-eyed, enthusiastic, and endlessly fascinated by the paranormal, Ray gave the team its sense of wonder. And honestly, without him, the Ghostbusters might not have existed at all. In 1984, Dan Aykroyd was 32 years old and already a comedy powerhouse. A veteran of Saturday Night Live, and one of the sharpest minds in the business, Aykroyd didn't just star in Ghostbusters, he co-wrote it. The entire idea for the movie actually came from his fascination with the supernatural. While other kids were reading comic books, Aykroyd was diving into his family's history of spiritualism and paranormal studies. Ghosts weren't just a funny concept to him, they were serious business. That passion spilled onto the screen. Ray Stantz wasn't cynical like Venkman or dry like Egon. He was the kid at heart, the one who got excited about every ghost sighting, every strange noise, every gadget they invented. Remember his line, "Everything was fine until Dickless here shut off the containment unit"? Delivered with genuine outrage, it wasn't just a joke, it was Ray's belief in the mission. To him, busting ghosts wasn't just a job, it was a calling, and that childlike enthusiasm made Ray so lovable. Whether he was strapping on the proton pack for the first time or buying the dilapidated firehouse because he thought it was a steal, Ray brought the team and the audience along for the ride. Off-screen, Dan Aykroyd's career only grew bigger. He starred in hits like Trading Places, The Blues Brothers, and Coneheads. He became known not just as a comedian, but as a true Hollywood multi-hyphenate, writer, actor, producer, even businessman. And yes, he carried that fascination with the supernatural into real life. He's still deeply involved in paranormal research, and he even founded Crystal Head Vodka, famously sold in a skull-shaped bottle, because of course he did. Today, Dan Aykroyd is 72 years old. He's still active, still sharp, and still the same wide-eyed believer at heart. He reprised his role as Ray in Ghostbusters Afterlife, 2021, stepping back into the firehouse and proving that some passions never fade. Seeing him again reminded fans that Ray wasn't just a character, he was the embodiment of Aykroyd's own lifelong curiosity. Ray Stantz may not have been the funniest or the coolest Ghostbuster, but he was the most sincere. And in a movie filled with sarcasm, jokes, and giant marshmallow men, sincerity mattered. Dan Aykroyd gave Ghostbusters its heart, and almost 40 years later, that heart is still beating. If Ray Stantz was the soul of Ghostbusters, and Venkman was its wisecracking charm, then Egon Spengler was its brain. Played by Harold Ramis, Egon was the definition of deadpan brilliance, a man who could explain crossing the streams with perfect seriousness, while the rest of us were just trying to keep up. In 1984, Harold Ramis was 39 years old. By that time, he was already known in Hollywood not just as an actor, but as a formidable comedy writer and director. He had co-written Animal House and Stripes, and was building a reputation as one of the sharpest minds in comedy. When Ghostbusters came along, he wasn't just cast as Egon. He also co-wrote the script with Dan Aykroyd. Together, they blended Aykroyd's paranormal obsession with Ramis's sharp, structured humor. The result? A story that was both outrageous and weirdly believable. Egon Spengler, though, was unlike the other Ghostbusters. He wasn't loud or flashy. He was precise, serious, and almost robotic at times. Ramis played him with an intensity that made even his strangest lines feel completely real. Who else could talk about mold and spores as a hobby and make it sound normal? His poker face delivery gave the film its anchor. Amid all the chaos, Egon was the one you trusted to actually understand what was going on, even if you didn't, and it worked perfectly. While Venkman was making jokes and Ray was geeking out, Egon stood tall as the steady genius, the guy tinkering with gadgets in the background. His partnership with Janine, the snarky secretary played by Annie Potts, added a subtle comedic spark too, her flirtatious energy bouncing hilariously off his stiff, scientific demeanor. Egon may not have been the funniest Ghostbuster, but he was the one who made the whole thing believable. Without Egon, the team is just 3 guys in jumpsuits. With him, they felt like real scientists who could actually build a proton pack. Off-screen, Harold Ramis's career kept climbing. He directed Caddyshack, National Lampoon's Vacation, and later Groundhog Day, films that are still considered comedy masterpieces. Ramis wasn't just part of comedy history, he was shaping it. His writing style, his directing, his ability to mix absurdity with sincerity became the blueprint for an entire generation of filmmakers. But his impact wasn't just in the movies he made. Ramis was beloved in Hollywood as a mentor, a collaborator, and a friend. He wasn't the loudest or flashiest figure in the industry, much like Egon, but he was the one quietly making everything better. Sadly, Harold Ramis passed away in 2014 at the age of 69 after battling illness. His death hit the comedy world hard. Fans mourned not just the loss of Egon Spengler, but the loss of a man whose fingerprints were all over the films that defined their childhoods. When Ghostbusters Afterlife was released in 2021, the film paid a touching tribute to Ramis and to Egon. In a story centered on Egon's family, his spirit loomed over the entire film, both literally and emotionally. The final moments, where the Ghostbusters reunite with a spectral Egon, gave audiences around the world chills and tears in equal measure. Harold Ramis may be gone, but his influence is everywhere. He helped create some of the most iconic comedies ever made, and he gave us Egon, the quiet genius who reminded us that science could be funny, deadpan could be powerful, and sometimes the smartest guy in the room doesn't need to say much at all. Egon Spengler wasn't just a Ghostbuster. He was the brain that held it all together. And Harold Ramis? He was the mind behind so much of what made comedy in the 80s and 90s unforgettable. When the Ghostbusters first set up shop, they were three quirky scientists knee-deep in ectoplasm and technical jargon. But then came Winston Zeddemore, the everyman, the guy who walked into the firehouse with a resume in one hand and a "when do I get paid" attitude in the other. And suddenly, the team felt complete. Ernie Hudson was 39 years old in 1984 when he suited up as Winston, the fourth Ghostbuster. Unlike his colleagues, Winston wasn't in it for science, glory, or even curiosity. He was a New Yorker looking for steady work. And busting ghosts, well, it paid the bills. His famous line says it all. "If there's a steady paycheck in it, I'll believe anything you say." That one sentence captured the beauty of Winston. He was practical, grounded, and he gave the audience someone to latch onto. Because let's be honest, most of us wouldn't be inventing ghost traps. We'd be like Winston, just trying to make rent and hoping we don't get slimed too badly in the process. Hudson's performance brought balance to the team. Peter Venkman was sarcastic, Ray was excitable, Egon was stoic, and then there was Winston, the guy who reacted like a normal human being. When the others were debating dimensions and ecto-containment, Winston was the one saying, have you guys thought about Judgment Day? His dry, street-smart commentary made the absurdity of the ghost world feel real. And that's why fans connected with him. He was us, in the middle of all the madness. But behind the scenes, Hudson's story is even more interesting. Landing the role wasn't easy. Originally, Winston was written with a much larger backstory and was supposed to join earlier in the film, but rewrites cut much of his material, leaving Hudson with less screen time than expected. Still, he took what he had and made Winston unforgettable. Over the years, Hudson has spoken openly about his initial disappointment, but also about how much he's come to embrace the character and the love fans have for him. Because even with fewer lines, Winston became iconic. The Ghostbuster who reminded us that not every hero needs a PhD. After Ghostbusters, Ernie Hudson kept working steadily. He showed his dramatic chops in films like The Crow, gave us intensity in HBO's Oz, and popped up in countless TV shows and movies. He became one of those actors you always recognized. The dependable, versatile face who could jump between comedy, drama, and action without missing a beat. And he never walked away from Winston. For decades, Hudson has been a fan favorite at conventions. In interviews, he often says how grateful he is that Winston connected with people, especially kids who saw him as proof that anyone, no matter where they came from, could be a hero. Today, Ernie Hudson is 79 years old and still going strong. In 2021, he returned in Ghostbusters Afterlife, slipping back into the jumpsuit like no time had passed. And in that film, Winston finally got the recognition he deserved, shown as a successful businessman who never forgot his roots with the Ghostbusters. It was a full-circle moment that gave fans exactly what they'd always hoped for. Winston standing tall as an equal, a leader, and a legend. Winston Zeddemore may have joined the team late, but he became the glue that held it together. He was proof that you didn't need to be a scientist to be a hero. You just needed courage, grit, and maybe a little faith in a steady paycheck. And Ernie Hudson? He turned that grounded, practical Ghostbuster into one of the most beloved characters in the franchise. Because in the end, Winston wasn't just busting ghosts. He was busting the idea that only geniuses get to save the day. Sometimes, the everyday guy is the one we need most. Every great ghost story needs a haunted house. But in Ghostbusters, that haunted house came with rent control, a nice view of Central Park, and a tenant named Dana Barrett. Played by Sigourney Weaver, Dana wasn't just the damsel in distress. She was the grounding force that pulled the Ghostbusters' chaos back into something resembling reality. Until, of course, her fridge started doubling as a gateway to another dimension. In 1984, Sigourney Weaver was 34, and already an icon. She had terrified audiences 5 years earlier as Ellen Ripley in Alien, proving that women in horror and sci-fi didn't have to scream and run, they could fight back. So when she stepped into Ghostbusters, fans expected toughness. What they got was something different. Wit, elegance, and a surprising willingness to play along with the comedy. Dana Barrett wasn't a scientist. She wasn't tossing out sarcastic one-liners or geeking out about proton streams. She was a cellist, just trying to rehearse Mozart in her apartment when she found a demonic temple growing in her fridge. Weaver played Dana with this perfect blend of sophistication and disbelief. She was the normal person in the movie, the one who reacted the way we might react if eggs started frying themselves on the counter. Her bafflement made the Ghostbusters' antics feel even more outrageous. And then there was her chemistry with Bill Murray's Peter Venkman. On paper, it shouldn't have worked. A sarcastic, womanizing scientist chasing after a refined musician. But on screen, electric. Weaver had a way of cutting through Murray's goofball energy with a single look, and their banter gave the film heart. She wasn't just the love interest, she was Venkman's equal, constantly challenging him and forcing him to grow up. Dana's story took a turn when she became possessed by Zool, the gatekeeper. Watching Weaver switch from witty, skeptical musician to sultry, otherworldly demon was a revelation. It was eerie, it was funny, and it was proof of her range. Few actresses could deliver lines like, "Are you the Keymaster?" with that much conviction and make it both creepy and hilarious. Off-screen, Ghostbusters expanded Weaver's reputation beyond horror and drama. She became one of the rare actresses who could anchor blockbusters across multiple genres, from sci-fi to action to comedy. After Ghostbusters, she returned as Ripley in Aliens, earning an Academy Award nomination, and continued building a career full of iconic roles. Working Girl, Gorillas in the Mist, Galaxy Quest, Avatar, Weaver didn't just pick projects, she picked classics. Today, Sigourney Weaver is 75 years old and still a force of nature in Hollywood. She reprised Dana Barrett in Ghostbusters 2, and decades later returned for a cameo in Ghostbusters Afterlife. Even in just a few minutes of screen time, her presence reminded audiences why Dana Barrett mattered so much. She wasn't just the woman living in the haunted apartment, she was the human heart of Ghostbusters, the character who made the absurdity feel believable. Sigourney Weaver's Dana Barrett taught us that sometimes you don't need a proton pack to stand out in a ghost story. Sometimes all it takes is a sharp mind, a skeptical eyebrow, and the courage to open your refrigerator, even if there's a demon dog waiting inside. If Ghostbusters had a secret weapon, it wasn't a proton pack or a ghost trap, it was Louis Tully. Played by Rick Moranis, Louis was the nerdy, lovably awkward neighbor who somehow kept stumbling into the supernatural mayhem. He wasn't a scientist, he wasn't a fighter, and yet, in his own bumbling way, he became one of the film's most unforgettable characters. Back in 1984, Rick Moranis was 31 and already a rising star thanks to his work on Second City Television, SCTV, Canada's answer to Saturday Night Live. He had this unique brand of comedy, part deadpan, part goofy charm, that made him stand out. When John Candy turned down the role of Louis, Moranis stepped in and completely reshaped the character. Candy had imagined Louis as a loud, eccentric guy with big German shepherds. Moranis instead leaned into awkward silences, nervous chatter, and a tiny nerd-next-door vibe that turned Louis into comedy gold. Louis Tully was the kind of guy who left his apartment door unlocked because it's just easier that way, then got possessed by Vince Clortho, the Keymaster, and started running wild through New York City asking strangers if they were the gatekeeper. Moranis' transformation from mild-mannered accountant to wide-eyed, possessed lunatic was hilarious and oddly endearing. His performance gave the movie an extra layer of absurdity. Like, sure, ghosts and demons are terrifying, but watching Louis try to host a client party while counting everyone's tax deductions? That's pure comedy. What made Moranis special was how he always brought humanity to his roles. Louis wasn't just a punchline, he was the little guy you rooted for. In Ghostbusters 2, he even suited up and joined the team for a moment, proving he had more courage than anyone gave him credit for. Off-screen, Rick Moranis went on to define an era of family-friendly comedy. Spaceballs, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, Little Shop of Horrors, The Flintstones. He was everywhere in the late 80s and early 90s. But in the late 90s, after the tragic loss of his wife, Moranis stepped away from Hollywood to focus on raising his children. It wasn't a dramatic exit, just a quiet decision to put family first. For years, fans missed him, and his absence became almost mythical. Then slowly, he started popping back up, a voice role here, a commercial there, and most recently, word of a return in the upcoming Shrunk, a continuation of his beloved Honey, I Shrunk the Kids series. Today, Rick Moranis is 72 and remains one of comedy's most cherished figures. He may not have chased fame like some of his co-stars, but his impact is undeniable. In Ghostbusters, Louis Tully reminded us that you don't have to be a scientist or a hero to be part of the story. Sometimes it's enough just to be the awkward neighbor who makes everyone laugh and accidentally unlocks a gateway to another dimension. When we talk about Ghostbusters, 1984, the conversation often jumps straight to proton packs, slimy green ghosts, and Bill Murray's wisecracks. But let's not forget about the glue that held the firehouse together. Janine Melnitz, the no-nonsense secretary played by Annie Potts. From the moment she buzzes in with her classic Ghostbusters, "What do you want?" you know Janine isn't the type to be fazed by much. She's the grounding force in a world of floating books, giant marshmallow men, and scientists who sometimes act like children. And Annie Potts? She played her with a mix of sarcasm, wit, and charm that made Janine more than just the receptionist. She became a fan favorite. Annie Potts was 31 when she slipped on Janine's oversized glasses and snappy New York accent. At the time, she was already carving out a career in Hollywood with films like Corvette Summer and Heartaches. But Ghostbusters gave her something different: cult immortality. Janine's banter with Egon, her quick clapbacks, and her ability to keep the Ghostbusters in check made her the queen of side-eye before side-eye was even a trend. After the first Ghostbusters, Annie went on to star in the 1989 sequel, this time with a slightly glammed-up version of Janine. Fans still debate which Janine they prefer, the sharp-edged, original 84 version, or the more softened look of 89. Either way, Potts delivered. And for kids of the 90s, her voice became instantly recognizable as Bo Peep in Pixar's Toy Story franchise, adding yet another layer to her legacy. Outside of the ghost-busting world, Annie Potts had a huge career on television. She was one of the stars of Designing Women in the late 80s and early 90s, where she proved once again that her comedic timing and warmth could light up the screen. She later popped up in shows like Any Day Now, Law & Order, SVU, and more recently, she's been winning new audiences as Meemaw on Young Sheldon. But she's never left her Ghostbusters roots behind. Potts returned as Janine in Ghostbusters Afterlife, 2021, and Ghostbusters Frozen Empire, 2024. Seeing her on screen again, still rocking that Janine energy decades later, felt like a wink to the fans who've loved her since the beginning. Today, Annie Potts is in her early 70s, and she's just as sharp and vibrant as ever. While the guys might have been out wrangling ghosts, Janine was the one who kept the phones ringing and the business alive. She wasn't busting specters with a proton pack, but make no mistake, without her, the Ghostbusters wouldn't have lasted a week. Annie Potts turned what could have been a background role into an unforgettable character, one that fans still quote, cosplay, and celebrate to this day. She's proof that sometimes the person behind the desk is just as legendary as the ones out in the field. Ghostbusters, what do you want? And nearly 40 years later, we still want more Janine. Walter Peck. The very name still makes Ghostbusters fans roll their eyes, sigh heavily, and mutter, "That guy." In 1984, Peck was unleashed upon the world as the Environmental Protection Agency's most smug inspector, a man whose only superpower was bureaucratic pettiness. He was played by William Atherton, who at the time was 37 years old and already carving himself a reputation in Hollywood as the go-to professional irritant. In Ghostbusters, Peck wasn't a ghost, wasn't a demon, wasn't even someone with a proton pack, but somehow he managed to be the scariest thing in New York by almost single-handedly causing the apocalypse. One unplugged containment grid later, and the city was swimming in ghosts because this guy couldn't handle a little ectoplasmic mystery. Atherton leaned into the role with absolute precision. He wasn't twirling a villain's mustache or firing energy beams. He was weaponizing smugness. He brought the kind of face that made audiences want to boo him in the theater. And let's be honest, his most famous contribution to pop culture might be giving audiences someone they love to hate. And if Ghostbusters wasn't enough, Atherton doubled down. He went on to play similarly loathed characters in Die Hard as that pesky reporter Thornburg, and again in Die Hard 2 making sure Bruce Willis's bad day got even worse. You could almost hear casting directors whispering, "Get me the guy audiences want to punch in the face." Atherton was that guy. Today, William Atherton is 78 years old, and while the years have mellowed his real-life demeanor, his cinematic legacy remains intact. He's earned respect for his work across film, television, and stage, appearing in everything from The Sugarland Express to The Day of the Locust, showing he wasn't just a one-trick pony of obnoxiousness. Still, his cultural immortality is tied to Peck. Fans don't ask him about his more serious roles. They want to talk about Ghostbusters and that infamous line about his anatomy, courtesy of Bill Murray. Atherton himself has joked about how playing the jerk followed him through his career, but rather than run from it, he embraced it. After all, being cinema's most punchable man is a rare honor. So when we look back at Walter Peck, it's not just about the character, it's about William Atherton's uncanny ability to bring him to life. At 37, he became the poster child for bureaucratic villainy. At 78, he's still remembered, quoted, and occasionally booed at fan conventions, with a smile on his face. And maybe that's the beauty of it. He may have tried to shut down the Ghostbusters, but in the end, Walter Peck made sure we'd never forget them. Or him. David Margulies might not have had a proton pack strapped to his back, but make no mistake, his role in Ghostbusters was just as vital. At 47 years old when the film hit in 1984, Margulies stepped into the polished shoes of New York's mayor, a man tasked with keeping the city together while supernatural chaos spilled onto the streets. And in true New York fashion, he did it with a mix of skepticism, impatience, and just enough political savvy to know which side of history he wanted to be on. What made Margulies unforgettable was the way he played it straight. Here was a guy surrounded by bickering scientists, a power-drunk EPA agent, and an impending paranormal apocalypse. And somehow he still kept his composure. When Walter Peck tried to sell him on bureaucracy, the mayor's face said it all. He didn't have time for nonsense, not when half the city was rioting outside his window. And when Venkman made his plea, Margulies gave us one of those perfect cinematic moments of relief, the politician finally backing the underdogs who were about to save the world. It was subtle, but it mattered. Margulies didn't just stop there. He came back in Ghostbusters 2 in 1989, once again forced to deal with another supernatural nightmare in the Big Apple. By then, audiences knew what to expect. He was the mayor who rolled his eyes at chaos, but ultimately made the right call. A steady hand in a world gone insane. Beyond proton streams and slime rivers, Margulies carved out a strong career. He popped up everywhere, from Brian De Palma's Scarface to HBO's The Sopranos, and built a reputation as one of those actors you might not know by name, but whose face instantly made you trust the scene. He was versatile, reliable, and quietly brilliant, the kind of actor who elevated every project he touched. Sadly, David Margulies passed away in 2016 at the age of 78. But his turn as New York's mayor has lived on in pop culture, right alongside the Ghostbusters themselves. He wasn't the guy busting ghosts, but he was the guy who gave them the green light to do it. And in the end, that makes him part of the legend. And then we have Alice Drummond as the librarian, the unsuspecting hero of the very first paranormal encounter in Ghostbusters. She's just going about her day at the New York Public Library, minding the books and shushing the occasional noisy patron, when the air turns cold, the lights flicker, and the first ghostly chaos descends. Floating books, whispering voices, and that iconic wide-eyed terror on her face. Drummond sold every second of it, making the audience believe that the supernatural was very real and very terrifying. She was 56 years old at the time, already a veteran of stage and screen, with a career built on bringing warmth, depth, and humor to every role she touched. Even in a scene lasting less than a minute, she made an impression that audiences still remember decades later. After Ghostbusters, she went on to appear in films like Awakenings and Ace Ventura: Pet Detective, and countless TV shows, often playing quirky, eccentric, or endearingly stern women who lit up every scene they were in. Alice Drummond had a gift for making the extraordinary feel believable. She didn't need flashy effects or big lines. Her presence alone made the library scene work. And while the Ghostbusters were zapping spirits and saving Manhattan, she gave us a human anchor, someone to fear for, and someone to laugh along with when things got out of control. Sadly, she passed away in 2016 at the age of 88, but her legacy lives on every time that library door creaks, books float off the shelves, and a newcomer steps into the world of ghosts and ghouls. For just a few short moments, Alice Drummond reminded us that even the smallest roles can leave the biggest mark, welcoming us into the weird, chaotic, and endlessly entertaining world of Ghostbusters. And that's our trip through the world of Ghostbusters. From the wisecracking heroes to the unforgettable side characters who made New York feel alive, chaotic, and endlessly entertaining. Whether it was the bureaucrat you loved to hate, the mayor trying to keep a city from collapsing, or the terrified librarian who kicked everything off, each of them left a mark on cinema history. Decades later, they still make us laugh, cringe, and cheer, proof that sometimes the smallest roles and quirkiest characters are the ones we never forget.